Hey folks, welcome to our discussion of genetics and some of the terms that Mendel used. Hopefully after this you'll understand the difference between a dominant and recessive allele and how they show up in the phenotypes. So here we go. So first of all, just a quick review. There's phenotypes and genotypes. Phenotype, again, is what you look like. It's an expression of your genes. So your phenotype is the characteristics that you actually show outwardly. Your genotype is what informs your phenotype. In some cases, and this is the stuff that Mendel figured out, there are things found in your genotype that are not present in your phenotype. And that's where things get really interesting. And hopefully we can explain a little bit of that right now. So imagine you want to go out to see a movie with your friends tonight. You want to go out and see a movie, of course you have to ask your parents. And when you ask your parents, there's several possibilities for what they could say, assuming you live in a traditional household with both parents there. So let's say you go out and ask your parents, and you ask your mom, and she says yes. And then you ask your dad, and he says yes. If both of your parents say yes, it's pretty obvious you're going to go out. Let's say your mom says no, and your dad says no. Well, since they both said the same thing, you're probably not going to go out or you're going to get in a whole bunch of trouble. But things get interesting when one of your parents says yes and the other one says no. Now, if I were me back in the good old days, I'd probably go out. I figured one parent said it, that's good enough for me. I'll try and ignore the second one and go on out. So if one parent says the thing that I'm looking for, I'm going to go ahead and go out. Probably get in some trouble if I do this thing the wrong way. Some of you have very parents that are really forceful and stuff, but at the same time, that's probably what I would do. And so obviously you want to go out. So as long as you get one parent who says it, you'll go ahead and take that as a chance to go out. So we call this the dominant response. The one that you're looking for is dominant. You only need one copy to say it in order for you to do it. The response you don't listen to, unless you get two of them, is what we call the recessive response. So in our case, the don't go out is the recessive response. And we use these same ideas in terms of genetics. Remember, in genetics, you also have two different sets of information, right? You have one that you got from mom and one that you got from dad. So your phenotype has to resolve the fact that you have two sets of information or two sets of instructions. Like every other instruction, you have to decide which allele to listen to if they're different. It's simple if they're the same, but when they're different, that's when we get the interesting stuff. Once again, the allele that you listen to, if you have copies of both, is what we call the dominant, and the one you don't is called recessive. Remember, again, you have two sets of instructions for any characteristic that you have. You have the one-end information you got from mom and the one-end information you got from dad. That's what made you. And so you, like this baby here, you have two sets of instructions for nearly every characteristic. In other words, two alleles for two traits for each characteristic. So for example, he might have his mom might have given him the allele for blue eyes, and dad might have given him the allele for brown eyes. And he has to figure out which color eyes to show. And that's where Mendel comes in and shows us some really interesting things. So first of all, just like in our coin lab that we did over the last few days, we choose letters to represent each characteristic. The letters don't really matter. You kind of just pick one. Often it's the first letter in those characteristics. So for example, in our coin lab, we use the letter D. This worked for us. The reason we chose D is back in the good old days, I used to do this lab with just dimes. So D for dime. It doesn't really matter. If you're doing eye color, you might use E, hair color H. It's really up to you depending on your alleles and your characteristics. Now, Mendel furthered this by not only using a letter, but representing dominant alleles by using capital letters and representing recessive alleles by lowercase letters. So anytime you see an allele with an uppercase letter, you know that's the version that's dominant. If you see the lowercase letter, that's the one that's recessive. And so we call these dominant and recessive alleles, and they combine to give us our genotype that then informs our phenotype. So there are really four possibilities the way you can think of it, right? To begin with, you could be what's called homozygous dominant. Homo meaning same, and zygote meaning the actual gene itself. Homozygous dominant means you have 2 copies of the dominant allele. Just like when your parents say you can go out and you can go out, both of them are giving you the dominant characteristic, so obviously you're going to show that dominant phenotype. So 2 big A's, 2 big B's, 2 big G's, whatever. In these cases, you're going to show the dominant phenotype because you have 2 copies of it. You can also be homozygous recessive. Homozygous recessives are 2 copies of the recessive allele, just like both of your parents saying no to going out. If both of them say no, you're going to follow that response. And Mendel represented these with 2 lowercase letters. These are called homozygous recessive, and again, they show the recessive phenotype. But really, where we get the interesting stuff is when you're heterozygous, where you got 1 copy from mom that's dominant and 1 from dad that's recessive, or vice versa. So you have copies of each allele. In these cases, you express the dominant one. If mom says you can go out, dad says you can't, you got 1 copy of the dominant, so you go out. And if the opposite was true, you also would. So 1 copy of dominant, 1 recessive is heterozygous, or a heterozygote if you're using the noun, and these show the dominant phenotype. So, for example, back to our kid, remember our baby had 1 allele for blue eyes and 1 allele for brown. Well, in humans, so they'd look like this. This would be their genotype, with 1 big E and 1 little e. Brown eye color happens to be dominant over blue eye color. So, with that being said, since he's a heterozygote, he has 1 copy of each allele, 1 for the dominant and 1 for recessive. Since brown is dominant, and he has 1 copy of each, he would have brown eyes. And this is how Mendelian characteristics work when we talk about genetics. Many of our characteristics follow this very clear black and white, where you either have it or you don't. And we call these Mendelian characteristics. Your ability to roll your tongue is dominant. If you can't roll it, that's a recessive characteristic. All you need is 1 copy of the dominant allele to be able to roll your tongue. Some of you in this class probably can't roll your tongue, and that's because you have 2 copies of that recessive allele. There are other characteristics here you can see. Your hitchhiker's thumb, if you have it. If you don't have it, you're recessive. I actually have the recessive characteristic there. See, there's my thumb. It goes straight up. It doesn't kick back. So I have 2 copies of the recessive allele and so on. Axolotls, when we talk about their body color, it's also a dominant, recessive, true Mendelian characteristic. And so we'll be talking about that a whole bunch in the next few weeks. Thanks, you guys. Good luck. And that's the end of our presentation.